Well, good day to everybody who has joined us here at the Dynamic Talks webinar, Getting App Modernization Right, Hear from the Experts. This webinar is being brought to you by Grid Dynamics and AWS, and we are so happy and delighted that you could make it here today to share in this, what promises to be a very interesting conversation. My name is June Bauer, and I really encourage all of you, if you have anything that you'd like to add to the conversation, you can most certainly at any time go into the Q&A or into the chat and let us know your thoughts. We welcome your participation. We welcome your questions. So if you want to ask a question in the Q&A or in the chat, please feel free to do that at any time. And if you just want to comment or carry on a side conversation relative to what we're talking about, the more the merrier. And we would love to have your participation in this conversation. We think it's going to be interesting, and we know it will be even more interesting if you want to chime in. So please, we welcome your feedback. I am so excited to be here today, and I know I am personally looking forward to learning a lot from the experts that we have here with us today. So let's go ahead and introduce our panel. So, Andrew, can you kick it off for us and give us a short introduction?
Yeah, for sure. And first, thank you for the Grid Dynamics team for having me chat with you guys today. Really excited to start the conversation. But yeah, my name is Andrew Park. I'm a partner solutions architect here at AWS, and my focus is on containers and application modernization specifically. So working with both technology and consulting partners on building their app mod practices to support the AWS portfolio of modernization tools, which includes containers and serverless. So excited to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
That is great. And it's so great to have you join us. And, you know, there's no company, I think, better positioned to talk about this than AWS. So we really appreciate you being a part of this today. And Juan, how about an intro from you?
Sure. Juan Urena, Director at Cloud and DevOps. Been in the cloud space roughly over 11 years, primarily doing major digital transformations and working with SaaS companies. Looking forward to this conversation. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you, Juan. And I am June Bauer, and I am going to be your host and moderator today. I'm so happy to be here. I come from a long career in Silicon Valley, getting to work with some amazing tech companies, including Apple, Adobe, Cisco, startups, Alcatel-Lucent, and many others. And I am now consulting, and I have this wonderful opportunity to host these webinars where I have such an honor in meeting with wonderful people like Andrew and Juan and learning from them. And I hope you're going to have that same experience today. So to get started today, what I thought would be a great way to make this webinar really useful to all of you who've taken your valuable time to join us is to ask you if you wouldn't mind answering a few questions. And we're going to give you 2 poll questions. And by answering those, we can really target what we're going to talk about in a way that'll be most useful to you. So, Alex, if we can bring up the first poll question, and go ahead, you should all see it on your screen. And panelists, if you would like to go on mute, that would be fantastic. And the rest of you, please go ahead and fill out that first poll. Okay, how about if we take a look at what people said? Well, it looks like a lot of you are just starting your journey in modernization, and this is a perfect time to learn. And then it looks like a good number of you as well are kind of at the part where you're working on this and trying to make it happen. And some of you are even fairly advanced. So it looks like we got people all over the board, except we don't have people who are just at the very beginning phases of execution. So it looks like we've got people either thinking about what their approach is going to be or way into it and looking for new things that they can learn. So that's helpful. Let's go to our next question. So here what we want to know is, what are the topics that most interest you for today's discussion? We can talk about all of these, but knowing what you care the most about is going to help us. So click anything here. You can click as many as you want that are things you'd like us to talk about. Ooh, it looks like everybody is interested in everything on the list, which is great. Biggest amount of interest is on technology. Pros and cons. I'm not surprised about that. That was my bet before we gave you the poll. So that's really helpful to know. But we've got a good chunk, at least a third of our audience is interested in every single one of these. So that's great because we actually can talk about every single one of these today, and we will plan to do that. So with that being said, let's get started. All right. So I have a good question to begin with here, which for those of you who are just thinking about getting into application modernization, I know that it's a phrase that gets used a lot, and I think it means different things to different people and companies. And Juan, I'm wondering, how would you define application modernization in the enterprise landscape?
Sure, I'll take that. I look at it as three different areas, basically. Believe it or not, there's still the traditional lift and shift in the cloud, where people are, dipping their toe in the cloud and for one reason or another want to move from legacy to cloud platform, but want to do it. Timing might be an issue. It could be compliance, it could be security, but it's basically, it's the least intensive, but gets you up and going in the cloud, which is traditionally what people used to do probably over the last 5 years. The next one is the big one, refactoring, where you're rewriting. You might have monolithic apps. You want to move more to a microservices architecture, basically. You probably want to containerize your workloads. And it's really the most, what I'll call lift to get there, basically. But what's really going to give you probably the biggest bang for the buck long-term, and could probably, give you a springboard to where you want to go and unblock innovation, basically, and just really progress with your company in the cloud. The last one is a replatforming one, basically, and that's basically where you look and some things are just limiting you on-prem for one reason or another, or you want to go from one database managed resource to another for one reason or another. I'll give an example. With this one, basically, things like we've actually partnered with AWS to roll out what's called a starter kit, where we're moving basically from Pivotal Cloud Foundry over to AWS microservices platform, and basically based on the AWS EKS blueprints. And what you get with that is basically the best of all worlds. We can move your workloads from on-prem PCF or in the cloud PCF onto basically AWS fairly quickly. It's some things that used to take 4 to 6 months, basically being able to do it hopefully in a matter of days. And then the replatform might come in the form of, hey, I have a database that's on-prem that's just not making my needs, and I can get more bang for the buck, basically, and scale up a lot more better by using an AWS resource. So I really look at it as those are the three main areas where, with regards to modernization, where people are one way or another focused.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. It's interesting here about the three areas. No matter how you cut it, there is some work involved in making this transition. And I'm wondering, why should it matter to the people who are listening in their audience? Why should they care about application modernization?
Do you want me to take that?
Yes, I would.
Okay, fair enough. A lot of it, what I've seen actually industry is people look towards modernization for the most part because their existing technology is limiting them one way or another. They're chained up, they got handcuffs. I've seen situations, basically, I had a customer in the cruise line industry where what happened is their processes were limited by mainframes, or a vendor that was on-prem, basically, that, the client wanted features in the product that they wanted, and they decided that it was going to be in a roadmap for that vendor, basically, but it was too far down the road. So they decided, hey, we can build this ourselves, right? And in a quicker time frame, basically, be able to leverage that. And then what it resulted in was more capabilities, more offers, different revenue streams, things that were constraining the business from really growing and developing. It really opened it up in a big way. So that's one of the biggest reasons for modernization.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, I mean, it really seems to give you the ability to be a lot more agile as an organization, to move faster and get more done more efficiently. Would that be right?
Yeah, by far. The other thing that it does is it really, what I've seen with modernization, it actually transformed what I call the ways of working for your organization. And it actually allows you to move more towards automation. It allows you to be more agile. It allows you to, if you're looking into DevOps and deploying a lot more, it helps you with that transition. And it also becomes sort of you can use it to teach your organization in terms of best practices in modern application development. So it really accelerates that. But like I said, it's a win-win from all perspectives. You can bring more value. We can hopefully impact revenue in a big way, but it can also transform your engineering organization.
Interesting. Okay, well, hopefully we're going to talk more about that because I have a lot more questions. But let me turn to Andrew next, because it would be great, because I know AWS, obviously giant leader in this industry, and you probably have the opportunity to work with many, many customers. So I'd love it if you could share an example of how application modernization has benefited customers.
Yeah, so there's one customer in particular that comes to mind when it comes to what good looks like for app modernization on AWS. And so basically what we were able to do for this particular customer was we were able to create an innovation flywheel, if you will, for this particular customer. And what this basically led to was them breaking down their legacy applications, or their monoliths, if you will, into modular architectures using serverless and containers. And this leads to a few things, right? Faster release cycles, more productive development teams, implementation of automation to make those development processes much more effective, and even transformation of talent and organizational goals, right? Because as you modernize your technology, you have to have the talent and organizational support in order to make those things happen, right? And the final thing that led to is kind of changing their thought process to have more of a data-driven process for making technology decisions, which also led to them being able to hit their business outcomes much quicker, right? And so there's three main things that I'd want to call out for this particular engagement. For this customer, they reduced their overall compute cost by 95%. They cut their processing time from 36 hours to 10 seconds. And they also went from releasing 10 deployments per hour up to all the way up to 50 plus deployments per hour. And so, when you think about it, when you take this approach for modernization using modern technologies, this is just one example of the various benefits that you can get from it, right? And so, as we modernize and as we introduce more solutions in the market today, again, this is just a simple example of the benefits that your customers and your clients can get from taking this approach. I just want to call that out as that's kind of like my go-to, just because, for such a short engagement, the level of benefit that they got from it was pretty remarkable. So that's one of the examples that I'd call it that for sure.
Yeah, I love that example. I mean, that is like really, those results are really like eye-opening. I mean, is that just you chose to share that because they got the best results, or can other companies expect similar results?
Yeah, for sure. I think we'll probably get into it a little bit later, but I think, when there's alignment between what you're trying to do with what the customers' business outcomes are, it makes the conversation and that journey for them much easier, right? And so while this was just a single example, I could probably spend the whole, this whole fireside chat talking about the different success stories that I've been able to be part of for app modernization at AWS. But yeah, that's just one that typically comes to mind.
That's cool. So I guess the people who are listening in and are at the beginning of their journey, that's pretty inspirational to why you need to get moving on this, because there are some huge benefits there. I'm curious, Andrew, what exactly is application modernization on AWS, and how does AWS think about it, and how is it different from other solutions out there?
Yeah, June, that's a great question, because when you think about application modernization, especially today, that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, right? To some folks, that means mainframe modernization or migrating from mainframes to the cloud. For some folks, this is just implementing certain automation tactics and tools into their development processes. But when I talk about application modernization at AWS in particular, basically it comes down to taking a containers or serverless first approach. And really breaking down those legacy applications or those monolithic applications into microservices using containers and serverless. And when you take that approach, you really do see the benefits that I just talked about in that customer example that I just brought up. And then also when you think about it from a business standpoint, right? You're not only are you improving ROI, but you're also reducing the total cost of ownership by taking this approach. And what does that lead to? That leads to the increased efficiency for your development teams, greater business agility, and all sorts of things, right? So I guess at a high level, that's basically what I'm talking about when I talk about application modernization on AWS, is again, taking a containers and serverless first approach.
Yep, that makes sense, breaking it down from the monoliths to the smaller pieces. And Juan, I want to turn back to you and ask you, because I know Grid Dynamics works, again, very similar to AWS with many, many customers who are in process of making this transition or thinking about making this transition. I mean, do you have an example that you might be able to share about how application modernization helped somebody?
Yeah, I can go back to that example with the cruise line industry. Again, this cruise line was basically on-prem, looking to go to the cloud, and they knew it's definitely where it was part of the strategy. But they wanted to take, what would make the most impact. And they took it from two perspectives, which was actually smart. What they did is they looked at it, how could basically we increase our customer experience by moving to the cloud? Things that took too long to be able to provide products or other revenue streams, how can we make that sort of our driving goal with moving to the cloud? So also, this was a customer that had different business lines, 5 different business lines, and there was duplication of efforts across those business lines. And what they did is they did 2 things. One, they moved to the cloud basically and modernized on this new modern platform that could scale and be able to serve more customers. The other thing is it helped them unify their business lines to sort of have a common architecture and technology, and use that as sort of like what I call the foundation for all things moving forward in a big way. So first thing is they focused externally and focused basically on the people piece and how to create a better experience for their customers. In this case, it wound up being, a digital app that basically removed the need for paper, digitized everything. So if you've been on a cruise line and you wanted to, order a drink on a ship basically, or be able to, schedule excursions, all that was driven by basically the modernization, which in the past they couldn't do because of the limiting systems. Then what they did is they turned it internally, which is pretty smart, and take a look at how do we impact our business internally. And what I mean by that is one of the areas they picked was onboarding new employees was a process that used to take about 3 months. By being able to modernize, digitize their applications, and now leverage the existing core foundation that they provided for the customer experience, they were able to reduce that for somebody that used to take 30 to 45 days, or even more, to basically 3 hours. And that includes because the ability to be able to have your medical documents, all the questionnaires, everything that had to be filled out, all that was digitized and driven by the platform. What that led to actually was also, they're like, wow, what else can we do now that we're doing this? And what they did is they actually, and this is smart, this is before COVID, believe it or not, they actually said one of the other things to impact the customer was be able to get contactless check-in. Surprise, surprise. Like whoever thought that would be a big deal. At the time, it was more about expediting customers onto a ship. But with COVID and everything else, it became the future. So it really accelerated, and was a predecessor to what would be needed for COVID. So it really helped them get an edge on their competitors, basically, and drive, a great experience for the customers.
Oh, I love that story. I mean, that's great. And it's interesting how they were onto something that ended up being even more useful for them because of COVID. So that's a great story. Well, hopefully those of you who are listening right now are feeling like, wow, if I haven't started this yet, I need to get going because this is the future. And this is what's going to give you the agility to create a great customer experience. And quite frankly, to probably be more competitive as well. I love it. But I think for people who are now kind of facing this, what seems to be a really big change for the organization, application modernization, I'm wondering, Juan, what would a modernization strategy look like? And what would be the actual steps in that strategy? Can we get more concrete here so people can start to think about how they would be executing this?
So the first thing is take a look at what are the technical characteristics of your applications, right? What are the existing limitations? How does that translate into moving to the cloud? And with that also, what are the business needs? For example, if you're in retail, it's Black Friday, I need to be able to scale to millions of customers. What does that look like? It's a limitation I have now. How does that look like in the system? So be able to do that analysis up front and take a look at what your existing pain points are now is the first start. And then after that, go a little bit above the horizon basically and take a look, what should we shoot for basically in terms of what we want for the application. I think you should always try to shoot for more than what you don't want to do is like, great, we accomplished what we have on-prem in the cloud. We should shoot for more basically. once you have that, the other thing that's big in moving to modernization is to evaluate your skill sets within your organization and the learning curve and get in being able to move to the cloud. And that's really a big gotcha that sometimes people miss. And also with that, how do you also bring best practices towards modernization to be able to apply that as you're bringing your applications forward? Then what you do is you take a look at it, and of course, a lot of these things can take multiple years. But what you want to do is, especially to the business and the higher ups, you want to drive business value up front. So you take a look at, okay, and you phase it out. You take a look at these, phase one will be, we're going to migrate existing customers onto the cloud, and whatever we're going to provision and services, that's going to be phase one, basically. The idea being that, let's take a look at what it's going to take to be able to implement, but only that, but what is the ROI and the business value that we're going to drive phase to phase, basically, as we validate everything. So basically the ROI on modernization. And then the big thing is, and then it's as a cycle and repeat, basically. Go ahead. What is the next thing that you're looking to build, basically, and be able to build it and be able to validate it. And again, driving business and making sure, you're driving the business value that you want from the cloud. So it basically allows you to validate, yourself on being in the cloud, basically, and running your apps there. But also you're driving major business value that you can go back, basically, and now the client says, well, if you can do this, what about XYZ? What will it take to get there, basically? But at that point, you've got this, like I said, this core foundation, like a house, that you can build anything on top of. And I think that's really where the strategy comes into play. If you try to go big bang with things like this, with anything, it doesn't really work. It's got to be more of a phased approach where you analyze, really take a look at what you have. Is it a good candidate for the cloud? And if so, what it's going to take there. I think one of the things to be careful with those strategies are, a lot of people a lot of times go and say, hey, we're going to go from monolith to microservices architecture. And I've seen the opposite, where people go all the way to the right with microservices strategy, and things become too granular to the point where now you're reproducing data, you have duplicative data across the board, and that's even worse. So there's got to be that balance, and that's why that assessment and the analysis of what's a good fit and also a good architecture makes a lot of sense.
Well, that makes sense to me. My curiosity was piqued by something you said around ROI. So I'm wondering, how do you measure ROI for these projects?
A lot of it, believe it or not, is so you get into one of the things that people don't do well in the cloud, no matter where you are on the journey, it's always an afterthought, is what I'll call FinOps. And it's actually this it's everybody's focusing it in a big way, especially when you have a slowdown economy. And what it allows you to do is take a look at what are, if you do things properly, you tag your resource, it actually allows you to take a look at where is my money being spent and what is my return on investment. For example, if I built this platform to be able to get better customer acquisition, what is it really costing me to acquire a new customer and be able to return that back? And what is the impact downstream? So the idea is, as you're building this, you're building these KPIs for your business that you can go back and be able to measure on a quarterly basis to make sure that you're getting the return on investment that you want.
Yeah, that's great. That makes a lot of sense. Well, thanks for sharing that. Andrew, I want to turn to you now, and let's get into what our audience said they mostly wanted to hear about, which I'm sure you love talking about, and that is technology. So the question I've got here that I'm wondering about is, there's a huge discussion going on now in the industry around containers versus serverless. And it would be great if you could help us understand, when you're making that decision, what do you need to consider? Should it be one of them that you choose, or both of them? How do you decide this, and why should you decide on one versus the other? Like, help us understand how to make this decision, if you could.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it's funny because this is the exact same question that one of my customers had a couple of years back, with respect to, which one do I choose? How do I go about it? What are the benefits of both? Et cetera, right? And so at the start of the engagement, the way we kind of framed it for this particular customer to help them make that decision was kind of helping them think about the 5 pillars of modernization on AWS. And so basically, the first pillar for modernization on AWS is, what's going to be the most effective way to break down those monoliths using containers or serverless. And based on your business requirements and your technical talent that you have on your team right now, like what's going to be the most effective for you? The second point that we kind of dove into was what's going to be the best operational model that's going to help you leverage managed services from AWS to kind of help you achieve those operational goals. The third point that we dove into was how do we implement automation and standardization of the software delivery lifecycle to make your development process much more effective and quicker. And then here's a really important one that a lot of people don't really think about is the alignment on management and governance of your workloads and platform that you'll be choosing, right? And then the last one just kind of comes together more naturally when you think about these other 4 pillars is what about the management of your data using purposeful databases on AWS, right? Because at the end of the day, when you're modernizing, right, like you want to remove that technical overhead from your technical folks so that you can focus more on business outcomes and delivering better products faster for your customers, right? And so when you think about it in that context, it kind of makes that decision a lot easier, right? Because for example, like if you are doing edge computing, let's say that you're doing some work for like a retailer, for example, right? And they have to have compute resources at various edge locations across the world. Like is serverless really going to be the best fit for that? Like probably not, right? Because if you're operating in an on-prem data center, like I don't even know how you would go about serverless in that particular scenario, right? And that's just one example. But if you want to talk about containers in that context, you could easily run multiple clusters across your global footprint and kind of do that work for you. So the best thing is obviously just taking a look at the customer's business requirements and kind of what they're trying to achieve and kind of work backwards from there. With serverless, like we're certainly getting there to the point where you could certainly do that at some point. But today is just not possible, right? So in that context, like running containers at the edge for edge computing just makes a lot more sense. So that's kind of the way I like to look at it. It's not necessarily like which is better, but it's more about which is going to be better for my particular use case and which is going to be better for me to help reach my business objectives much quicker and more effective, right? And it also goes back to talent too, right? Like you have to just be honest with yourself and take a look at your development teams and your technical resources. Like if I choose something like Kubernetes, like do I have the resources to actually make that happen? And if not, like what does enablement look like for my technical resources to get up to speed? The same goes for serverless. Like not everyone is an expert in serverless. And if you want to take that approach, you have to be prepared to train your technical resources in order to be able to do that. Like I've ran into so many customers that they kind of like buy into the hype of Kubernetes where, they think Kubernetes is going to fix everything. But in reality, like Kubernetes is a very complex beast that a lot of organizations just aren't ready for, right? And so with that said, like I've worked with customers where they just kind of jump the gun, make the executive decision to go all in on Kubernetes, but it kind of just backfires because their organizations were not ready for that transition, right? So I'd really encourage, the folks on today's call or talk to really think about, is Kubernetes actually going to be, the thing that saves my business, right? Because a lot of times it's not. So you really have to dive into these requirements and business outcomes and kind of work backwards from there. Because I've seen too many customers not take that approach and fail, unfortunately. So that would be my message is, it's not containers versus serverless. It's which one's be better for my particular outcome that I'm trying to achieve, right?
Yeah, I think that is such good advice. And I feel now like my approach would be to call you and to call Juan and to say, help my organization make this decision, because there are a lot of factors that you've got to consider in making the decision. I thought it was interesting that you brought up that there are technical factors based on what you're trying to do and what your business goals are, but there are also organizational factors. And I know probably many of you that are joining today are more technical people, but I think it's so easy to overlook things that can make or break it that have to do with the people that you have. And I think that was a great point that you made. We should all take a minute to think about that because, yeah, Kubernetes is incredibly complex and it's a beast of a thing to manage unto itself. So I totally get that. I'm wondering, Andrew, maybe if you can help us in understanding, how do you evaluate and select container orchestration platforms? And when do you recommend people leverage ECS, EKS, or Fargate? Can you help us with that kind of conundrum?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a conversation I have almost like on a daily basis at this point. And so I guess I'd start off by saying that, I think there's this notion in the industry today that like Kubernetes won, right? But, whenever I hear that, I always have to ask myself the question, well, what is it that they want, right? Like, like I didn't even know that there was a competition in the first place, right? Because at the end of the day, container orchestration platforms essentially do the same thing with just different levels of complexity and flexibility, right? So the thing is like when you compare something like ECS and EKS, like again to my prior point, everyone's like, oh, like we have to go EKS, like Kubernetes is the answer, like that's the future. But is it really? You know what I mean? Because like you really have to think about your workloads. Like if your workloads don't require that level of complexity and that level of flexibility, if you will, then is EKS actually the answer, right? So for example, like if you just have a front end website that you need to deploy for your customers, like are you really going to deploy that to something like EKS? Like probably not. Like the better answer there would be something like ECS, where you have that level of simplicity that you need just to have that container orchestration. Because when you think about something like ECS, like one, like you have a level of scale that you would need to scale your workloads up and down. You have things like placement groups for heterogeneous workloads. And you basically have everything else that you would need to be effective in running a container orchestration platform for your particular workloads. And so what I would say there is like, again, just like work backwards from what you actually are trying to achieve, because sometimes like you don't want to over engineer things just because it's Kubernetes. Like to me, that makes no sense. And quite honestly, like I've ran to enough customers where they're so insistent on going all in Kubernetes that, you know, at the end of an engagement, they realize, oh, like we didn't actually need this in the first place. Because the way to think about Kubernetes, it's kind of like having 1,000 knobs, right? And of those 1,000 knobs, you have to find the right configuration of those knobs to work for your particular workloads, right? And if you can't do that, it's just going to blow up in your face, right? So at that point, it would make more sense to use ECS for something that doesn't need that level of complexity. Because if your organization isn't ready to handle the complexity that Kubernetes is today, you're just going to fail, and it's just not worth it, right? And honestly, I've had conversations with a lot of customers in helping them understand, like, hey, like if you go to ECS, like, will this meet your requirements minus the level of complexity? And when the answer is yes, like it saves them so much time and pain and effort and money, more importantly, right? And so again, like, you know, when you guys are having these conversations, like you really have to understand, like, do I actually need the level of complexity that Kubernetes provides? And most of the time, the answer is no, unfortunately, right? Or unfortunately or fortunately, right? So that's question itself. And so then when we introduce Fargate into that equation, right, which is basically a way to run serverless containers on ECS and EKS, I would encourage you to ask the same question, right? And the question of Fargate comes a lot around regulatory customers that have to abide by certain requirements depending on the industry that they're working in. And so the one thing that people tend to forget is, you know, when you're using Fargate, it's using serverless technology. And what that means under the hood is that every time you deploy a Fargate task or a Fargate node or pod, it's going to have its own isolation boundary, and it doesn't share the underlying kernel, CPU resources, memory resources, et cetera, right? And so when you think about this in the context of regulatory requirements, think about things like ISO, PCI, SOC 1, 2, and 3. Maybe you're working in healthcare and you have to abide by HIPAA eligibility, right? When you choose Fargate, like that would be a good choice if you have to meet those requirements, because Fargate automatically meets those regular requirements, because you're basically isolated at the host level. Like for example, like if you deploy a Fargate task or a Fargate pod and you try to exec into it, like it's not going to work. So for that reason, a lot of customers in regulatory industry or spaces use Fargate for that reason, because it just makes their lives a lot easier. So they don't have, so when they go through the reviews, the reviewers, oh, you're using Fargate, okay, that makes sense, right? It's obviously a lot more complicated than that, but at a high level, when you use Fargate for these types of requirements, it just makes a lot of sense for those customers, right? But I guess to to just really think about the level of complexity that your workloads are going to require and work backwards from there. And I promise you, like when you actually do that, the answer to the question of, well, should I use ECS, EKS, or Fargate becomes a lot more apparent and a lot more clear. But you really have to take the time to understand the workloads and understand kind of the future vision as well. Like, at some point, you may introduce heterogeneous workloads into your environment, right? Maybe it's going to be a mix of like GPU workloads, in combination of a bunch of other things that you might have running, right? And so when that situation comes about, like, how are you going to handle that, right? And so those are just a few things to help you kind of guide that decision for you and your organization. But this is also just based on the number of customers I've worked with over time and helping them decide whether they should use ECS, EKS, maybe both, right? So that's kind of what I would say there.
Yeah, I have a question for you. That was really interesting and really helpful. On Fargate, is there a reason a company might want to use it that isn't heavily regulated?
Yeah, so maybe they just want to take away the administrative overhead of managing the underlying compute instance itself. Because when you use Fargate, it's something that's AWS managed, and you can't even see it, basically, right? Much like if you deploy a Lambda function, or if you invoke a Lambda function, like you can't really see the container or the instance coming up and kind of doing its thing, right? And so, for companies that just don't want to manage it, like Fargate's not a bad option, right?
It's basically your invisibility cloak, as it sounds from what you're saying. So
Basically,
that's cool. Yeah, that's cool. Well, that was great. That was super helpful. And Juan, I'm going to turn to you now, because another hot topic in application modernization is whether to go cloud agnostic or cloud native. And I'd love to hear what you think the factors are that a company should consider when they're making that decision.
First, let me get into why companies decide to go one versus another. First of all, the easy thing to do basically is say, hey, I'm going cloud native. It gives you the most resiliency and scalability out of the box and gets you up and going fairly quickly, to be quite frank. There's nothing against that. There's still, like everywhere else, there's still this whole thing about, well, if I go all in with one provider, do I have all my eggs in one basket? And that's really the primary reason that people look. And I even had, actually, in the healthcare industry, I had a client basically that, as we were providing our architecture for our solution, what they want to see is like, great. It's like, I want to know the difference between if we went all in cloud native versus cloud agnostic. So in most cases, what you're going to see is sort of a hybrid approach where you got a little bit of both. In certain areas, certain things that are more, cloud agnostic are things that I've seen, like, API gateways, identity access management, things like that, where basically what they want to do is they want that portability for things like that. And that's what cloud agnostic allows them to do. Sometimes it also brings best of breed, right? It turns out that, we have a client that wants to bring in Palo Alto firewalls, basically, for one reason. It's what they use across the board, and it's what security is blessed, basically. So in that case, that's another reason why people will go a little bit more cloud agnostic with their solution. Really, it's a matter of, people want to know is, what is the portability? And if I decided to go somewhere else, what would that mean? How much of an overhead do I have to take care of in the future if I do that? In this day and age, that flexibility is there, which is great. It does bring in more complexity. The more you go hybrid, it does bring in a lot more complexity, because when it's all said and done, you're exchanging something that, AWS takes out of the box basically and manages for you, and now you have to manage that yourself. So everything from patching to upgrades to scaling it up, you have to take care of that all yourself. So it's a trade-off, to be quite frank. But I still have customers that they're like, I don't want to go all in cloud native. I want to balance it. What does that balance look like, basically? And how is the best of all worlds? What's happened basically is, you used to get to the point of, hey, let's do best of breed on-prem. Let's get the best of the best for all solutioning and all our architecture. Now all that's happened is that's transitioned over to the cloud.
All right, that's great. Thank you for that. And Andrew, is there anything you want to add to that? Because you do come from AWS, and if not, that's fine. We'll move on. But
yeah, so I think it's just to kind of add on to what Juan was saying, like this concept of like vendor lock-in, right? What folks have to realize is that the code that you develop, the scripts, all the technical artifacts that you develop, that's not owned by any of the cloud providers. Like, that is something that you own yourself, right? And so I think that's one misconception a lot of people run into, and especially like the concepts like Kubernetes, right? Like, that's all open source, and it very much still is an open source project today. And so whether you're on GCP, Azure, AWS, those technical artifacts are something that you own. So just be really careful as you're having these conversations with your customers and your clients, that vendor lock-in isn't actually as big of a deal as people think. Because again, like, you're the one that owns those technical artifacts. Like, so if you, for example, like if you write some code for a Lambda function, like, who owns that code? You do. So like, at that point, is it really vendor lock-in? No, I would argue no, right? It's more about the platform that you're using to execute that code and those technical artifacts, right? So I just want to be really clear, again, so when you're having those conversations, remember, you own those technical artifacts. So the concept of vendor lock-in actually becomes kind of irrelevant at that point, right?
yeah.
Andrew, quick question. How much do you see that a lot from your customers? Well, they'll challenge you as to cloud agnostic versus cloud native?
some of the newer ones. And I think it becomes really, really apparent when you talk about data transfer costs between clouds,
Ah,
because that gets really, really expensive very, very quickly. And when you
right.
kind of work, when you kind of do this exercise with customers, they change their minds really quick. Like unless there's like a very specific requirement, right, where they have to go multi-cloud. As soon as you show them the numbers, they're like, okay, never mind. let's not do that.
You're right. You're right.
Money talks, I guess. That's pretty interesting.
Always.
To know.
Yeah,
That's good to
sure.
know, for sure. And it's better to know now than to find out when you're having that conversation. So
Exactly.
those of you listening are finding this interesting. I am. All right. Well, both of you have had so much experience with this transition to application modernization in companies. And I'd love to ask both of you, and Andrew, I'll let you kick it off here, but what are some application modernization gotchas, like the things that you've learned over time that a customer might not even know to ask about in the beginning, and just help us understand what we should really be aware of that we might not even know to ask?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And quite honest, I could probably spend a whole hour just talking about the gotchas. But there's a couple key things that I would call out in particular. The first thing is, you can go through this modernization journey, but at the end of the day, no matter which decision you make, you have to have a set strategy for load and unit testing. Because I think one thing I see really commonly among customers that are kind of starting on their modernization journey is that when they think about scaling, for example, right, they try to have their application scale based on their infrastructure, but it's actually the opposite way around. Like the application or the underlying workload itself needs to be the first class citizen. And then the infrastructure that you choose to support that workload should be scaling based on the application itself. And so that's something that I see across a lot of folks that are on this modernization as kind of like a gotcha, right? Because eventually you can get to a certain point where your infrastructure or your environment, if you will, gets so complex that you don't really know what to do from there in terms of scaling based on your particular workload. So just like having that set from the start can save you a lot of pain later down the line once you start adding more workloads and more different things into your environment itself. So again, like just make sure that the infrastructure is scaling based on the application or underlying workload and not the opposite way around. And honestly, like I think everyone in this day and age needs to have a set strategy for unit and load testing, because then how are you supposed to know which compute resource you're supposed to use? How are you supposed to know what things should be scaling off of, right? And it just begs all these different types of questions. But if you have these strategies set in place from the start, then those questions get answered on its own, right? And I think that's one misconception I see across a lot of customers that don't have this in place today. So I'll pass over to Juan, but that's one thing I see a lot.
I think that's great. Yeah. Go ahead, Juan.
I agree with you, Andrew. I mean, in my case, what I've seen a lot of is I go back to FinOps. It's really what I'll call financial management in the cloud. One of the good things about the cloud, it's easy to get up and going, basically. One of the bad things is it's easy to get up and going, basically, and you can get fairly careless if you don't have the right governance and right financial management. And it's not until all of a sudden your bill goes from $3,000 to $20,000 a month and like what happened that people really focus on it. And sometimes, believe it or not, that happens for 3 to 6 months. And it really doesn't matter whether you're new in the journey, whether you've been there 3 to 5 years or 5 years plus. Pretty much, financial management in the cloud, I think, is one of the biggest gotcha that shocks people. And something as similar, and Andrew, you could probably relate to this, something as simple as logging in the cloud, as simple a concept as that means, I've seen that be 20 to 30% of a cost for a customer, basically. And it's unnecessary. Sure. It's either over provisioning, you're mismanaging resources, people stand up sandboxes and never take them down. A lot of governance around that will help you quite a bit in the journey. The other thing that I think, especially in modernization, is what I call over-architecting. I'm a big keep it simple, dumb. I won't say the other word. Basically, kind of guy, basically. But I think a lot of what you see is people, especially with microservices, going way too granular to the point where it's unmanageable, or they have to now overcome because they've over-architected the solution. So I think that's where a combination of bringing in a Grid Dynamics, of bringing in an Andrew like myself to help people to take a look at what is the best approach to what we're looking to do makes the most sense.
Yeah, that's great. Hey, I think it's interesting you both brought up this idea of governance. And Andrew, I want to go back to you and maybe put you on the spot just a little bit because, on one hand, AWS is there to make money from people using its network services. But at the same time, this governance thing is I think it's a big problem for a lot of companies that are further in their journey, because just like what Juan said, people stand up like a pilot or a sandbox or something else. And then all of a sudden it's like their, bills go way up. Does AWS provide tools to help people govern and manage all their networking and all of the activities that are going on in the network? Or if not, where can people get help?
Yeah, for sure. So to answer your question, we definitely do. We definitely do provide observability and governance tools to help you understand kind of what's going on within your environment and why, to one point, certain things are costing so much money. And then, there's also a bunch of great third-party options as well through some of our technology partners. Some of my favorites are like the Datadogs, the Dynatraces, the New Relics of the world. To provide that deeper level of observability into your environment and your workflows to help you understand exactly why certain things are costing so much. And not only that, but also to help you understand over time, where can we save money, right? I honestly think we're one of the few companies in the market today that encourage customers to spend less money with us. And the number of conversations I end up having with customers on hey, how can I help you spend less money? It's quite remarkable. So yeah, we definitely do. And I would definitely encourage folks as they're kind of going on this journey to really understand kind of what tools are available for you today to help you avoid those situations where you check your bill and it's like $100,000 and you can't figure out why, right? So honestly, investing into a tool that works best for your organization and your needs just goes such a long way. And there's not a right and wrong answer because there's so many different tools and solutions in the market today that will help you make those informed decisions, right? So for example, in the world of Kubernetes, my personal favorite tool is KubeCost. I really can't think of any other, solution or tool in the market today that gives folks the level of depth and insight into their Kubernetes environments that they do. And then when you think about this in the context of multi-tenant environments, right? What does that look like? Because as soon as you introduce multi-tenancy into the conversation, that is a whole different beast in itself. I'm sure Juan knows this very well. So again, just make sure that you are investing into a tool or solution that's going to work best for you and your organization. Because if you don't, yeah, things are going to get expensive very quickly. So yeah, I'll pass it off to Juan.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice. And Juan, I want to just ask you specifically. So you're a member of the Grid Dynamics team, and what does Grid actually do to help people avoid some of these gotchas that we've been talking about?
Some of the things that we do basically is one of the offerings is a cloud center of excellence. And what I mean by that, it's a cross-functional team, usually a combination. It's a hybrid of it could be multi-vendor, it could be and includes the client basically. And what it does basically, it lays out sort of best practices of how to work within the cloud. Think of it as, you want a blueprint for, I want to build a house. Well, guess what? The cloud center of excellence takes a look at that. It makes sure that, when you're building an app, you have observability in place. It has best practices for security. So as you're looking to make decisions, usually what happens is when you get this big behemoth of a digital transformation, making decisions takes a lot of time. Well, if you have this established cloud center of excellence, that's this cross-functional team, basically, it allows you to speed up through those decision points, take a look and say, hey, this is what worked. If we're looking to do single sign-on, CCOE has blessed this sort of pattern basically to be able to bring it to the finish line. So something that traditionally would take 3 to 4 months, guess what? Somebody's going to go quickly. Here's the pattern. By the way, architecture review is yep, we blessed that thing a year ago. We're good, and be able to move forward. But with that, you also get the governance, the policies that will prevent you from making future mistakes and from having churn. What you want to minimize as you're looking in modernization is you minimize of what I call work that comes because of churn when you do an implementation, basically. The Cloud Center of Excellence, basically what it does is it gives you it gives you best practice. It gives you the rails that you want to be successful in the cloud. And also it'll even make you accountable to say, okay, what is the ROI on this application, and make sure you can account to that so you can report that to the business. So things like that is what we basically help our clients with.
Oh, that sounds great. That's an amazing resource to think about. Well, we only have a few minutes left, but I want to spring a question on both of you here at the very end, because I know there's people on our call who have already been well underway in moving to a application modernization architecture and taking advantage of it. Are there any tools, technologies, or trends that you're seeing out there that somebody who is well underway here should be looking at to enhance what they're doing?
Yeah, I can start that one.
Sure.
So when we think about, like, I hate this term, but this is just what it's called. It's called like day two operations on Kubernetes. So basically it's the idea of like, hey, like, it's cool. Like you got a cluster up and running. That's great. But then once you start introducing workloads, you have to start thinking about things like governance, security, scale, networking, et cetera, right? And so one cool thing that we just launched here at AWS is EKS Blueprints. And basically this is an open source framework that will help you get your day two operations up and running much quicker. So we have a version in CDK, the AWS CDK, and then we also have a version in Terraform. And so basically it's powerful in the sense that as you define these templates for your blueprint, you can define the specific add-ons and configurations for your Kubernetes clusters, and then it kind of just deploys for you, right? Whereas before, that process and figuring out like which add-ons I want in my cluster, how to configure them, et cetera, I've seen organizations literally take like a year or two just to get that figured out, right? But now we kind of bootstrap that for you. So now you can get up in like maybe a month, maybe even quicker, right? By bootstrapping all that complexity for you. So that's one thing I'd call out. And then another tool that I've been a personal favorite of is anything really from Isovalent. So Cilium is probably like one of my favorite tools in the market today. So if you're looking for deeper level observability using eBPF under the hood, definitely take a look at Cilium and some of the other products that Isovalent is kind of working on right now. Just because for me personally, that's been one of my favorites at the moment.
Yeah, from my standpoint, with regards to observability, you mentioned a few earlier, like Datadog, New Relic. The more visibility you can have into your systems, but also I call it like treat your applications in the modernization world as a patient. You should know basically what are the 8 things that identify that gives me an indication that I have a healthy system or I don't have a healthy system. And then, you know, leverage, and for charting, you can use things like AWS has some great dashboards that you can build out of the box, basically, to give you that visibility in play. But things like that and bringing observability and traceability within your system is something that is lacking on-prem, very definitely needed in the cloud, and definitely something that you should pay attention to. It's one of those other things like FinOps that people just don't pay attention to, that they really need to.
Yeah, it's great. It's great you're bringing it to our attention. I love all your ideas as well, Andrew. And I hate to say this, but we are about to run out of time, and this time has just flown by. And I have learned so much from both of you. You guys are truly experts in this area, and I would love to continue this, and maybe at a later date we can. I know that Grid Dynamics will publish this webinar and some related material, and I would love to learn more because it's been fascinating. And just from this conversation, I know you both know what you're talking about, not just because you know, but because you've worked with so many customers, and we really appreciate your willingness to share your knowledge with us today. So Juan and Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time to join today. It's really been wonderful, so helpful. And to all of you who have joined and listened in on this conversation, hopefully you've learned some new things, you've gotten some good information, and worst case, now you know Juan and you know Andrew, and you can call them if you need help, which is what I'll be doing next.
Sure.
That's what I learned. But it's been fabulous. Thank you all so much for taking the time, and we hope to see you again soon on one of our Grid Dynamics dynamic talks. Thanks all of you, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.